Hello, everyone, and welcome to the panel on called Cultures Are Not Monolithic. And I am your moderator, Don Sakers. I'm a science fiction fantasy writer. I review books for Analog magazine, and I am a retired librarian. And we have a couple of housekeeping type things that we'd like to tell you guys about. And we want to let you know that the panel is being recorded. These things will be available after the con and probably in perpetuity on YouTube and various other venues. So if you want to share our sterling remarks with everybody else, you will be able to do that. Please notice, audience, at the bottom of the screen, you have a Q&A button. We'd ask you to put your questions in that. You can certainly feel free to chat, use the chat window all you want, but that tends to scroll pretty quickly and we may miss a question if it's in there. So please remember to put questions up in chat, in Q&A, and I will probably let it go until about 2/3 of the way through the panel before we start specifically answering questions, but we'll certainly keep an eye on what's there. And finally, I'm going to let my panelists introduce themselves. Let's go alphabetical order. Melissa Scott.
Hi, I'm Melissa Scott. I write science fiction and fantasy and have done so for quite some time. My most recent novel is Finders, which is available from electronic sources and fine bookstores most places for those who can get to them.
Fantastic. I'm John Wiswell. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm predominantly a short story writer. I also write essays and articles, usually about the genre. I've had work published in Uncanny Magazine, Nature Magazine, Fireside, Podcast, etc. I just adore secondary world settings, so I'm very happy to be here.
All right, excellent. Well, we're talking about cultures and the trope that we find so often in science fiction and fantasy of the culture or world or society that is absolutely monolithic. And I'm going, as shorthand throughout this panel, I'm probably going to be using Klingons as an example, even though I know we've seen, even back as far as Star Trek The Next Generation, there was the episode with the rare glimpse of Klingon culture, which happened at least once a month. But I know they've been doing a lot to, but let's use, if I say Klingons, that's what I mean, is a culture that would be kind of monolithic. But I'd like to ask our panelists, what examples can you think of a particularly bad example of making a culture seem monolithic? Whoever has one, jump in.
Tolkien's orcs are legendary for a reason. I love Lord of the Rings, but they're literally just the born bad guy militia. Like, there's so little texture to them that other authors have come along later trying to expand them. But it has led to the way in which Lord of the Rings has unfortunately aged the worst. Because there are many wonderful things about Tolkien's books. But that racial essentialism is something that really sticks out.
I think a lot of it, a lot of the examples that I'm coming up with are, Pulp era and Golden Age, the cat people of fill in the blank planet, where you're creating a culture that is. Well, they're all actually just cats with cats that have become intelligent, and that's in some ways to defend the trope a little bit, because I think there are places where it is not unreasonable to only see one facet of a culture. If you're looking at a star-hopping space opera, you're unlikely to see more than a glimpse of the culture of each planet that you visit, and it often does end up being, it's the planet of the cat people, it's the ice planet, it's whatever, it's the desert. But it's much more fun if you can make it less obvious, I think.
Mhm. One of my pet peeves, and this kind of goes for both the Star Trek and Star Wars universes, but particularly Star Wars, is that all of their planets seem to be about the size of a city block. And if you're told that someone has gone to XYZ planet, all you have to do is hop in your ship and go there, and you will meet them. And don't even get me started on the planetary systems that are kind of like would fit within the DC Beltway. Where once again you can go. Not only can you go from one planet to the next really quickly without going through hyperspace or anything, but if you happen to mislay your instructions and you can't find the person you're looking for on that planet, all you have to do is look back at your planet of origin, which is hanging up there in the sky, and someone will wave to you and say, "No, go to your left." And I think I think it's scale that really
Yes.
gets under my nerves when things are just too small.
And I think that scale, I think you're absolutely right that scale is one of the key questions. Although I have to say I'm kind of intrigued by the sort of culture where, in fact, everybody does know everybody, or is related to them. And now I'm thinking that ought to be a story somewhere.
Yeah.
But
Well,
the scale really does matter.
yeah. Okay, I invited you to do something bad. Let's hear something that you know of that does it really well.
So for me, like one of the cardinal ones is Guy Gavriel Kay's River of Stars, which is sort of set in a China analog that winds up provoking a war with the Mongolian analog. And it isn't an exact one-to-one. What's fascinating is that thanks to his diversity of points of view of the people who live in Kitai, this fictional nation, there's such a diversity of the experiences of what it is to be in a war. Some people are so far away from the front, they don't even know war's been declared. What it is to be a brilliant young woman attempting to break into the scholarly and poetic arts where you're in a misogynistic society is very different than the emperor who believes in his own power so much that he could cause a war out of pure hubris. So I think Kay and Kay's always been a master of very different points of view on a central conflict. I feel like that one might be his masterpiece.
Lately, I've been reading a bunch of T. Kingfisher's fantasies, and particularly I would mention both Swordheart and Paladin's Grace in relation to non-monolithic cultures, because you've got this, it's actually physically a fairly small setting. It's a handful of cities with a few folks. Hey, Stephanie. And yet within that, there are multiple religions, multiple priesthoods, multiple different perspectives on the world, and all in and also a very exciting set of plots and plenty of things going on. I mean, they're lovely books for that.
Hey, Stephanie, you're here.
Hey, sorry about that. I was outside and my alarm did not go off on my phone.
No problem. We have just gotten started. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. Sorry I am late. My name is Stephanie Burke. I'm also known as Flash. I am a multi-published USA Today best-selling author of over 90 novels. My pronouns are she and her, and right now I'm pulling it together. So again, I apologize for being late.
Not a problem. Well, that never happens in Rocons.
I know, really, it's for the whole Balticon feel.
Yeah. As someone who has been as much as like 10 minutes late to a panel, you're doing fine. What we had just finished doing was kind of getting started with the idea that cultures are not monolithic, and I had asked the folks to come up with a good example and a bad example of how this has been treated in science fiction fantasy. Did anything spring to mind?
Oh yeah, definitely. A lot of movies, especially from the 70s and the 80s, you can always go back to one of the first movies that actually cast Black people, all Black authors. I do believe it was Son of Igi, and that was in like 1950 48 or 49, everybody who was Black fell into two categories. It was either the Bill Huxtable, you know, the Bill Cosby Huxtable thing, when you're, you know, exceeded everybody else. So you were the doctor, the lawyer, and there was nothing else. Or you were the servant type, you know, help, basically. You didn't know anything. You ran around just to give somebody a reason to slap you, that Madame Butterfly, you know, I don't know nothing about Burke, no babies type of thing. That is like two of the most horrible examples I can say. And I can say it's bad because this is an example of that, what they call the good immigrant type of thing. Asian people get cast in this category a lot. It's putting, basically it's dividing minorities. So if you're the good immigrant, you fall in line and do exactly what you're supposed to do, and you held this person up to as an example for everybody else. And if you fail, you're not as good as those. And that is horrible, but that was a thing up until the 40s. Oh my goodness. That up until the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, I can think of some examples of that. Down to the Black person being the first person to always get killed in a horror movie. To popping up just to say bling bling y'all and have nothing of value. Now, some good examples of culture being a monolith is when they actually do research on some particular religions. I am going to go to the animated version of Castlevania. This freaked me out too. The character who is the necromancer, his name is Erwin, I think it is. They did so much research into the Muslim faith, and it showed because he denied alcohol. He gave his reasons for doing this. When he did something that was wrong, he said that this is bad. I'm not supposed to be doing this. I have to pray for this later. And I've noticed that if there is a fandom or a story or a novel or a movie that's out, when they do dig deep into that research about something, you can generally say, okay, this is general for all people of the Muslim faith. They can't do pork, they don't do alcohol. If they do something, they go and they pray about it, they have to atone for it. Things like that is like a positive monolith, I feel.
I think this is a great springboard to something that John raised when we were, before the panel, when we were all just talking. One of the big things about this showing cultures as being only all of one thing or whatever is that you've always got the question of who's left out, what are the marginalized people, what are the you know, when all the Klingons are warriors, what kind of Klingons are we not seeing? So anybody want to jump in and talk about that, or continue talking about that? Actually,
give me a minute. I'll come up with an example. Okay. I'm thinking now.
I know that we've got.
I got a perfect example. Still in the Star Trek universe, Vulcans. All Vulcans are this quiet, highly intelligent type of person. They know everything, they feel everything, well, they know everything, and they push their emotions down so far as to be they're non-existent. You never see the farmer Vulcan. You know, there was a desert planet. You know, they were harvesting water someplace. Somebody had to grow the food. You don't see shopkeeper Vulcans. If you do, in your mind, you know that they probably have PhDs too. But you never see the idiot, even when they go off and show their emotions and get kicked out or banished before they go to the Kobayashi Maru. They're still highly intelligent. You don't see one idiot, no matter how stupid they might act. You don't see no idiot Vulcans. I'd like to see that one who, you know, is just a failure that the parents are ashamed of.
What else?
Going back to the notion of the orc and the warrior culture idea. Well, off the record. Back on the record.
Sorry about that.
It's all right. In order to sustain something, even a reasonable sized military industrial complex, you can't just have everybody cradle to grave be trained to fight. Where are the blacksmiths? Where are the medical staff? If this is some weird culture where if you get hurt, you're out, where are all the disabled people? Where are all the amputees? What do they do with their existences? If it's some nightmare society where apparently you commit suicide if you fail at anything, where's the Undertaker industrial complex that is handling everybody who like got an F once and is dead now? Like, so these vast omissions, and of course, a lot of this is because our warrior cultures are just stock antagonists that are feeding in to often pretty problematic narratives of just wanting to see somebody you identify with beat up a lot of faceless people, which I feel like, especially now at our level of sophistication in writing, we can do better than that. And sometimes, you get something like Ender's Game, where after book one, we find out that, like, no, what you've been told about the bugs is wrong. And we expand on what we see about them.
You know what? I want to see an ugly fairy. Seriously,
Yeah.
you don't see
Plenty of
ugly
them.
fairy, they're always the shining, bright, beautiful people that everybody fall over. What happens if an ugly one is born? They disavow it? That's where your changelings come from?
Melissa?
But there are tons of them. That's the pretty one. The pretty ones are only pretty to fool you. There's plenty of ugly ones. There's the pixies. There's the bogarts. There's a ton of them that are just out there, and they're ugly and they're mean, and they got the red fangs, and they've got the red cap dyed with children's blood, and they're happy to. They're upfront about they're going to kill you.
Oh, you guys are talking mythological creatures. I was on bars.
Honey, they've not been. Oh, never mind. I'm not going to.
Melissa, who are you particularly aware is being left out?
Actually, people with jobs,
Mm.
people with a day job.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's something that is so often missing from both fantasy and science fiction is people who have to go to work for a living, and for whom the adventure is an interruption in their job, or it's part of their job, or it fits into the economy and the way they make their living in some interesting or catastrophic or incredibly fortunate way. But that's one of the pieces that I like to see well done.
Mm-hmm. I know that I have heard you remark before that there aren't enough people in science fiction or fantasy who take public transportation.
Well, that too.
Yeah.
There's often not enough public transportation.
Yep. And John, earlier you had mentioned disabled people. And I think that's a big thing that we're missing in cultures.
Right. I mean, especially as fantasy becomes increasingly just humans with magic or humans plus a weird thing. I'm always curious about where do disabled people exist within the society, because there's a panoply of potential disabilities. I have some difficulty walking. I have chronic pain, and I'm partially deaf. My existence intersects multiple disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
Do all of those not exist in every corner of a fantasy world? And if so, like how are we supposedly fixed, or how are we addressed? And if we aren't, then, like, if you're in a city that only has stairs, how have people who have mobility issues adapted to exist in that world? Because either they're all just dead, which is a weird fantasy world for you to create, or there's been some anti-ableist or disableist progress as a subculture to address the structural problems within a culture. And that is an easy, interesting point of view for just about any fantasy world. It is, how do the people who aren't blessed with the fantastic, who have mortal issues such as disability, existing, besides like the one top of her class wizarding school badass?
Yeah.
Very lucky.
Villains. It was a trope. As somebody who's disabled myself, it disturbed me to go back through a lot of the stuff that I love. If you find somebody with disabilities, they're your villains.
Yep.
Yeah.
They possess one eye, they're scarred up, they're missing limbs. Sometimes it's vanity that forces them into being evil, like the original Lex Luthor. And sometimes it was something to show how villainous they are because they're missing an eye or a scar or something. Look at all the James Bond's villains. Seriously, just about all of them had some type of disability, right down to mental disabilities have been villainized. So I think that's one monolith that we need to actually be aware of. Because if you find a bad guy, 9 times out of 10, especially in sci-fi, he's missing a limb. He's missing something. He's disabled in some way, and that makes him something to watch out for. Now, I love etymology, and digging back through, you know, the meanings of words, I go back to the word monster, because that's been applied to disability people a lot. Literally, it meant originally to stare. So the Romans would take out people who had disabilities, they would put them in cages, and then they would have them set up so that people can walk by, point, and would literally stare. This is a punishment from the gods. These people or their family did something to disappoint the gods. Therefore, they're a monster. So literally it meant to stare at. And they labeled anybody with this disability as being these monstrous things. It's a trope that's still successful. People still use it. And a lot of people don't understand why people who are suffering disabilities, no matter how minor or how major, get upset about it.
Yeah. When I was a kid, I would watch the Friday the 13th movies because I was a disabled kid, just rooting for Jason. I was like, yeah, get him. You're my guy. And another thing, another monolith about disability is everybody's disability has a tragic backstory.
Yeah.
No, it really doesn't. It doesn't have to be that way. I don't. You can give a character some personality other than, and some life experience other than, that their dad threw them down a pit and that's where they got that scar.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think some of the same thing goes for the trope of the sword and sorcery trope of the effeminate queer king.
Yes.
The queer sorcerer king, who I've always felt deserved to be the hero of the story because that would be ever so much more fun.
Yes. And just incidentally, since Stephanie mentioned it, I do have to point out that each of the three of you would make an excellent Bond villain.
Do it. I will do this. We'll make a pact right now.
Sure.
The four of us are going to bring Bond down. Okay, we're coming for you.
I know how to do it.
The one who has the Bond girl.
Bump the Bond girl. I have condoms. Let me see if we can exist. Somebody throws a condom at him. Slap. What is this? Lack of consent. Put him in a chastity device. He'd kill himself.
Okay, I think we should probably move on to the technique portion of our discussion. We actually have had a couple of questions asking us to move more in that direction, so it's probably a good idea. So, as a writer, a creator, how can you deal with the monocultural problem, and what can you do to let the reader know that you're not in a monolithic culture? Who wants to start?
You know, I got a million things to say anyway. So, number one, do your research. When you do your world building, you have to sit down and ask yourself, are you falling into any of these what can be considered negative tropes? As I am building up my world, am I doing a representation of a full culture, or just one part that I want people to see? Even if I'm working with one part I want people to see, you have to have the background and understanding of everything that's built up in this world that makes it run. So you have to have a mention, or at least give an inlinking to the people who are your side characters, who are not, you know, the main characters, but make what the characters doing all possible. And you just doing if you're building up a religion, why? Ask yourself why this would happen. Are there, like in everyday modern human religions now, there are different sets, there are different things that break off according to people's beliefs. You have to sit down and to make it, you know, to fill it in. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm dropping words. But you need to sit down and to make it a full, complete, and believable system of religion, you have to have diversity in there. There's diversity in every group that you would find. And that's just how we are, because unless you have this gigantic alien that controls everybody's mind to make them think and act the same way, you're going to have some diversity in there. Mm-hmm. So you have to ask yourself, am I being a representative of everything that needs to be represented that makes this world believable? It takes a little small thing to throw you out of escapism. Your suspension of belief is all based on if you can actually have belief in what's happening. So if you have a whole bunch of perfectly shaped aliens and with the perfect smiles and the perfect teeth, and there's no conflict in there whatsoever, it's not a plot point, it's going to fall apart real quickly on you. So do your research, and then, you know, look at and pay attention to what you're doing.
say that, like, every time a character, your main character, talks to anybody else is a gift. Every single conversation is a window into another point of view in your world. And probably the grocery store clerk and the bartender are not as bought into the status quo as the royal knights and the imperial gay wizard. You have, every time you have an opportunity to show what another person's existence in that world is like, and that makes the whole world deeper for the audience if you're fascinated in world building. It also makes the stakes of anybody we're supposed to care about feel a little more tangible. If their existence is tied to things, tied to concerns that are not ubiquitous or homogenous with everybody else's.
Thank you. Good
And I
point.
think,
Melissa?
and I think one of the things you said, John, earlier when we were talking beforehand, rather than looking at binary opposition, remember that there's a spectrum. And one of the things that was suggested to me once was to, rather than having two characters, have three, so that you don't have the good one and the bad one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
That's a good point.
You see this with families and kids. Sometimes you have the family with the good kid and the bad kid, but often when you add a third person to that mix, you can't have good, bad, and athletic. You end up bringing in. It becomes easier to bring in more characteristics, even if those characteristics are in themselves somewhat stereotyped. You're still working toward a spectrum.
I like that. How do you signal to your readers that you're aware of this issue? And
Oh, that's hard.
is it, I mean, you've talked about a couple of different ways to be aware of it and to structure your plot and whatnot, but is there individual language tricks that you use? I'm expressing this badly.
No, you're trying to express a difficult thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that that's something that it is hard to do all things well. Sometimes you have to pick your primary focus and do your best to bring in everyone else, but it is hard to do everyone well and to do justice to everyone's, to do justice to an entire world and its complexities in a single novel, even a single series.
You have to show, don't tell.
Yeah.
And one of the tricks that I use often is have that fish out of water character, be they human or somebody from a completely different culture. You drop them in there and they're going to notice and pick up on the things that the people that you are writing about in that world generally don't. And as that secondary character, or might even be your primary character, as they learn, the reader learns with them. And if there's any confusion and any explanations that have to be made, it's fine for this character to walk up to somebody in the know and say, excuse me, what is this about? And have them explain into the way that's not going to lapse into, too much exposition, but in a believable way that a foreigner or a visitor to this culture might understand. And that would help, the reader themselves understand what's going on.
And the hard part comes when you're trying to write from within the culture and create a believable picture. That's the trick where it gets really difficult to foreground the things that would be strange to a contemporary reader. And I think that's maybe the trick, is know what your likely reader is going to be wondering about and try to answer some of those questions. It's not. It's one of the more difficult things, I think, in this about this discussion.
I think a plot promise is a good trick. I'm sorry, Steph.
No, go ahead.
So, like a plot promise, like you think about the beginning of Trader Beru Cormorant, written by Seth Dickinson. Beginning of it is she's from an island culture that's being really just colonized almost out of existence through intense monetary policy. And the colonial power is extremely othered, which it's fair if you're going to do it to anybody. That's one. But there's a promise early on as she finds that she might have an in to get inside their power structure. There are a couple of character interactions that suggest that there might be more going on in that power structure that she's about to enter. So it's a promise to the reader that like what the bichromatic existence is about will be eroded, will be destroyed over the course of the story, that we're going to go somewhere where we're going to learn. And I think that's probably the easiest window in is promise that the character is going to grow in contingency with their knowledge, that they're going to grow an understanding of the world, and the reader is going to get to go along on that journey, and they're going to get to learn as well.
You threw me something too when you said that. I automatically thought of Dune. Do you remember the part when they were introduced and the guy spits on the ground? And they took an insult to that.
Yeah.
So another trick would be having your main character screw up in some way. And prevent myself from being killed. Let me explain what's going on. That enhances the reader's understanding within that world that's already built. So thank you for that one. That popped in my mind instantly.
It's a good one.
That is a good one.
Mistakes are awesome plot fodder.
Save me.
Yeah, that's why I live a richly plotted life.
One thing that I had a question about, and it's kind of a more sort of meta than what we've been dealing with so far, but so you've done a great job of making your cultures non-monolithic, and you've shown the different characters who don't fit the mold and all sorts of things like that. And then you have the reader who says, well, this is totally inconsistent. You know, Klingons are supposed to be warrior races, and yet this guy is a sales clerk. You know, this is a terrible book because it doesn't stick to its own rules. I hope I'm not softballing you guys here, but how would you answer that ridiculous criticism?
I would try to take into context the review, because there's somebody who's going to say that about every single book, and not everybody's criticism is as valid as the next person. Like if your problem is that Colson Whitehead's Underground Railroad doesn't depict everybody having the same experience, I'm sorry you didn't go to history class. Like that's not Whitehead's problem. But in a hard secondary world, it's a little more tricky. I think that like one of the easiest tools is just expressing that the characters are surprised or the characters are growing in their understanding. I think that softens the idea that the reader might have thought they were buying into a monolith, but if the character realizes they aren't, a lot of the audience will follow.
Or you do my favorite line, I'm so sorry you didn't find this work to your liking. Please try something else in my lineup. I'm quite sure I have something that will please you, because you cannot please everybody. People are going to nitpick. They're going to find stuff. They're going to dig. His pants were purple, or he's military and his pants didn't have enough pockets. There's always going to be somebody who wants to dissent just because. And I guess a lot of them, they troll just to see what you're going to say, what you're going to do, see if they can get a rise out of you. So for people like that, you smile, you nod, you pat them on the head, and you move on. You don't even engage with that. But if somebody has a legitimate concern, I mean, seriously, what happens to this is a warrior culture. What happens? And then you can do your best, like you said, to explain it in the novel. You can say, okay, maybe you can bring in something, the old warriors' retirement home, or, you know, the old warriors who lost a limb. One of my favorite things at DragonCon, they had a group called Retired Spartans. It was a whole bunch of guys who were out of shape with their girdles pulled up over their nipples, wearing sandals, socks, and sandals. I mean, there's a way you can actually sit there and do that. But in that particular world, it has to be common. It has to be, you know, part of that society. You don't have to go out of your way to please everybody. But if it's a legitimate concern, you can say, oh, well, so-and-so lost an arm, so-and-so lost a tentacle, 3 of his eyes popped out. So he's now into training, or he's now doing this, or he's now doing that. Or you can do, you know, what is it about the gigantic bugs? Fudge. Starship Troopers. If you read the book, you understand when these guys graduated, their sergeant popped off an arm and a leg when they were walking across the stage and made them, this is their reality of what war was. They had to walk across and shake this man's stump. You cannot get no more real than that, okay? Look, we do have warriors. Look, they do get injured. This is what they do. They now teach. So, I mean, there's a way to get around it. But if somebody wants to nitpick, you just pat on the head and move on. It's not worth your time.
Yes. I pretty much, they've said what I was going to say, because that really pretty much covers it. Those are the two ends of the spectrum there. You can explain if it's legit, and if it's not legit, you move on.
Yeah.
Okay. So take courage out there, those of you who are doing the good work of making your cultures non-monolithic. You don't have to pay attention to every criticism. Okay, let me see. We've got some questions, and I'd like to see if we can address some of them. We have one that says, what's the largest gathering or group that could reasonably be an actual monoculture?
Urban youth.
Okay.
Seriously, if you take people who are, I should say, especially low-income urban youth, these kids have a language of their own, a dress code of their own, a culture of their own. It doesn't actually matter what race you are. If you grew up struggling with these people and that group, everybody understands what's going on. And if you're an outsider and you step in, they're going to know. If you try to use their slang or their language that they've created, because language is one of the fastest changing things. As technology changed, so does our language and our slang. So if you come in and you try to use outdated slang or don't quite know what you're talking about, they're going to notice. And these people can you can generalize certain groups of these people with certain qualities. Number one, they're very loyal to their own. Number two, usually willing to stand up and fight. Number three, will not back down from anything. So if you want to try to throw a monolith on any group, I think this group right here would be your best example, because like I said, it's built up of a bunch of different people from different races and different cultures, but their struggle is the same. The underlying thing that they're fighting against the same. They have something major that's unifying.
I think that's a really good point, that having something that unifies the culture, having something to struggle against that is unifying, allows you to have larger and larger groups that are monocultures. Because without that struggle, I think you could barely get a family with a monoculture if you're not standing up against something. And I think that there's, even within those monocultures, there are different roles that are needed to make a group function, and people take on those roles as well, which, it's a monoculture on this end and not so monolithic or monocultural on the other, in that people are within the culture itself. I mean, I think of my own experience in the gay community, where, it could look pretty monolithic from the outside, but from the inside, there's an awful lot of politics and shifting and different roles and different perceptions, and, as you said, different language.
Yeah, I think queer community is an excellent one, including that there is diversity within the queer community. I'm ace and aromantic, and I was invited and welcomed in by bisexual men and trans people, and there's a unity within that. That also I would love to see just in more books in general, because there's never just two gay people in a country. Queer people find each other. Queer people pocket up and protect each other, and also they're looking to fall in love. They try to find they try to find companionship to meet what they need that the larger culture may prohibit, or certainly doesn't offer.
That's actually a general point I'd like to make about avoiding the monoculture, is there are so many subcultures like that, from the queer community to, anti-car fanatics. I mean, you have all these subcultures in the real world, and most of us belong to more than one of them. And I think it's really important and really useful as a technique to have your characters belonging to more than one of those cultures. And, you know, probably, and often marrying into yet another 3 or 4.
Which drags me right into just about any minority group in this country.
Mm-hmm.
We all have stereotypes that are laid on top of us. Like I said before, Asians are always considered the good immigrant. You have the Blacks that are considered, you know, at the bottom of the rung. You have the Latinas who are considered extra sensual and crazy. You have, there's just so many of them that you can sit down there and generalize. And people try to throw us in the monolith. It's not like we actually fit in, but to their eyes, this is where we are, when there's so many closed groups, open groups, and different subcultures in each of that. You can find 15 people in the Black community who will read sci-fi and love it, and I can find 30 whose parents refuse to let them read it because if it was something that was not going to enhance their education or bring them money, it's not worth it. So I do think truly there's no real monoliths. It's just how other people perceive groups, and it's generally on the exterior or the window dressing, so to speak. It's the generalizations that they tend to lay on people.
Yeah, shared trait over homogeneity.
Yeah,
it's like, I love the working class, but if your idea of the working class doesn't have Hispanic people and Black people in it, you're not really thinking about the working class.
Yep.
Like your idea of the working class is still just Roseanne's family, which wasn't true then. Like,
I want to pull out something from what the 3 of you have just said as a technique that I now recognize I've seen people use in writing is to have the single character who does straddle the roles in a society, which then indicates to the readers that the culture is not monolithic. And I know I've seen lots of good examples of that. So
yay for the half-breeds.
yeah, exactly. Okay, let's see. We have another question. Building that questioner points out that building cultures from mythologies of other cultures on Earth is a good way to start. But what do you do if you're going to do that? If you're going to model a culture after something on Earth, how do you avoid being, let's see, promoting stereotypes or discrimination, but making the story feel fresh? Has this been something that any of you have run into?
I could go on another 20-minute rant.
that's the thing. I feel like there's only 20-minute answers to this question.
Yeah.
It's a great question.
Yeah.
But I feel like it's imperative not just to research how people from that culture live, but also what art do they create about themselves? What do they say about themselves that you don't say and that your culture doesn't say? It's very important to not just promote what your culture thinks about their culture. Yeah. That always leads to ugliness. Yeah.
Research. And then after you've done your research on Google and the Library of Congress, you go find people in that particular group and you tell those magic words, hi, I'm a writer and 9 times out of 10, they'll be willing to help you so you won't get it wrong. That way you won't get that hate mail. And you get multiple multiple points of view before you sit down to craft your characters or your worlds. Therefore, you're not acting on maybe someone who was in power. I mean, look at the British invasion of India. If you look at it from Britain's point of view, they came in to help the savages. If you look at, and when they colonized, when you look at the average Indian's point of view, where did these white people come from telling me my religion is wrong, how to do this, how to do that, beating us up and enslaving us? How are you saving us? So there's always multiple points of view in that. Even in that, you have people who got along, who were guides and helpers, and then you have the people who became the so-called half-breeds, the children of these soldiers who were in there. Yeah. So there's a whole world right there in that one example that you have to follow. So, I mean, just be cognizant of what you're doing. Come at it from different angles. Get the perspectives and the written, get the written information done by different people from different walks of life, from different socioeconomical standpoints. Get it all. pull out of that what you need, and that way you'll have a character or world that's very well-rounded and inclusive. If you try to, to get it all together and try to get right down the middle, little bits of this, little bits of that, make that stew, like rock stew. Throw everything in it, everybody has to tell you, and then by the time you're done, you have a tasty dish that you can hand out to everybody.
I love that.
And I think also one thing that is useful is not just to borrow one mythology, but to see, figure out what it is that you're actually wanting. What is the piece that appeals to you, and take that piece from multiple mythologies. See how they would fit together. Try not doing what we've done on, what we have already culturally done. Do something different. Patch things together in a new way.
Yeah.
Long time ago, Catherine DeCamp recommended that if you're doing research and you're talking to people, which you should definitely when doing your research, that a good question to ask is, tell me 3 things that only someone who's in your position would know. And 3 tiny little details, and that can be really especially helpful when you're dealing with different cultures, because those things that the person tells you will come with a whole trail of cultural implications behind them that you can use for asking further questions. Okay, let's see. We are coming down to the wire, sort of. So let me ask if you guys have, if there's something that we haven't talked about that you wanted to be sure to cover, or just kind of an ending statement to sum up what you're talking about today. Melissa, why don't you start?
Okay, well, I think what I'd like to reiterate is all of this interest in cultures is in the service of character and story, and telling better stories. This is a way to tell better stories, and I hope we can all manage it. The more complicated, the less monolithic our worlds, the better the stories will be. And looking forward to reading them.
John?
I guess the last point that I'd make is be wary of writing a story about the only one. The only atheist in a world of Catholics, the only person who likes track and field in a world of football players, or whatever. It gets very tired and very strange to have a character who apparently doesn't share an identity with literally anybody on their planet. We have lots of other ways to be isolated. In fact, you're much more isolated if you share an identity with people and still don't have anything in common with it. And consider what makes you feel isolated if that's the sort of story you want to write. And try to share a little bit more of yourself with it, because that'll enrich your fiction.
And Stephanie, can you finish us off?
Yeah, I can say, yay, we're looking at different cultures. Yay, we're looking at different ways of thinking, which means that society is progressing. That means the ideals that started sci-fi and fantasy in the first place are stretching out into the main field. I love that. If people are willing to exert their minds and stretch and give a little bit of disbelief in something as simple as realizing that all cultures don't have to be monoliths, that will reflect in today's society, and that can do nothing but improve the way we're thinking. The fact that people are even asking for this and requesting stories like this shows that minds are opening, and people now are willing to take into different cultures things they didn't know, and they're willing to take a chance on something that they previously wouldn't have tried at all. I do remember when fiction and fantasy and just about everything in literature was all white. It was lily white, mayonnaise white. You could not get away from the white. It was blinding. And slowly we have different flavors creeping into that. So it shows that as a society as a whole, we're progressing. And I would love to see it more. So if you have a story that's out there that's going to show this wonderful diversity that we have going here, write it. Somebody will be there to read it. Let me know. I'll buy it and I'll read it. Just for, to see that we are progressing as people.
Well, thank you very much. Panelists, you guys were fantastic. I think everybody was very happy with this. I definitely want to specifically thank our tech crew and our programming staff for Balticon, because they have pulled miracles out of nowhere. Audience, really great job. Thank you all for that. And be sure to check in on Discord, where virtual Balticon will continue and continue. And finally, just be sure to go to the Balticon GoFundMe page. Okay. And thank you very much.